why don't you give me a call when you want to start taking things a little more seriously?
Why don't you love me, Jenny?
Well, why don't you come with us then?
There, it's done. Why don't you try it?
Why don't you leave them alone?
Come on. Why don't you take a look around?
Why don't you just shut up? Why don't you just calm down?
Why don't you ask Randall about it?
Why don't you get some sleep?
Why don't you come on down here? I'll show you.
Why don't you sit down? You'll be more comfortable.
Why don't you just fuck off?
What?
Why don't you ever let me sing?
Spaniel, why don't you fight?
Girlfriend. Why don't you stay in the bar? That night I got your numbers.
Why don't you take a time out?
Why don't you sleep?
Oh, why don't you get off your high horse?
Hey, Lars, why don't you come with us?
Then why don't you go to sleep?
Fine. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
Why don't you want to talk about it?
Why don't you get up now, my darling?
Why don't you then?
Why don't you put it down yourself?
Well...
John, why don't you tell everyone what you said?
He goes, no. Why don't you forgive Bethany?